Hello, I'm Jay. I'm reading from a little village called Ashburnham in East Sussex, England, and I'm reading chapter 18 of Jane of Lantern Hill. Jane, to her horror, slept in next morning, and when she rushed downstairs, she saw an extraordinary sight. Dad coming over from the Jimmy John's with a rocking chair on his head. He also had a gridiron in his hand. Had to borrow one to boil the codfish on, Jane. And Mrs. Jimmy John made me take the chair. She said it belonged to Aunt Matilda Jolly, and they had more rocking chairs than they had time to sit in. I made the porridge. It's up to you to boil the codfish. Jane broiled it, and her face as well, and it was delicious. The porridge was a bit lumpy. Dad isn't a very good cook, I guess, thought Jane affectionately. But she did not say so, and she heroically swallowed all the lumps. Dad didn't. He ranged them along the edge of his plate and looked at her quizzically. I can write, my Jane, but I can't make porridgeable porridge. You won't have to make it after this. I'll never sleep in again, said Jane. There is no pleasure in life like the joy of achievement. Jane realised that in the weeks that followed, if she did not put it in just those words. Old Uncle Tombstone, the general handyman of the Queen's Shaw district, whose name was really Tunston, and who hadn't a niece or nephew in the world, papered all the rooms for them, patched the roof and mended the shutters, painted the house white with green trim, and taught Jane how, when and where to dig for clams. He had a nice, old, rosy face with a fringe of white whisker under his chin. Jane, bubbling over with energy, worked like a beaver, cleaning up after Uncle Tombstone, arranging the bits of furniture as Dad brought them home, and getting curtains up all over the house. That girl can be in 3 places at once, said Dad. I don't know how she manages it. I suppose there is really such a thing as witchcraft. Jane was very capable and could do almost anything she tried to do. It was nice to live where you could show how capable you were. This was her own world, and she was a person of importance in it. There was joy in her heart the clock round. Life here was one endless adventure. When Jane was not cleaning up, she was getting the meals. She studied her cookery for beginners every spare moment and went about muttering, all measurements are level, and things like that. Because she had watched Mary, and because it was born in her to be a cook, she got on amazingly well. From the very first, her biscuits were never soggy or her roast underdone. But one day she flew too high and produced for dessert something that a charitable person might have called a plum pudding. Uncle Tombstone ate some of it and had to have the doctor that night, or so he said. He brought his own dinner the next day, cold bacon and cold pancakes tied up in a red handkerchief, and told Jane he was on a diet. That pudding of yours yesterday, miss, it was a mite too rich. My stomach ain't used to Toronto cookery. Them they're vitamins now, I reckon you have to be brought up on them for them to agree with you. To his cronies he averred that the pudding would have given the rats indigestion. But he liked Jane. Your daughter is a very superior person, he told Dad. Most of the girls nowadays are all tops and no taters. But she's superior. Yes, sir, she's superior. How Dad and Jane laughed over that. Dad called her Superior Jane in a tone of mock awe until the joke wore out. Jane liked Uncle Tombstone too. In fact, nothing in her new life amazed her more than the ease with which she liked people. It seemed as if everyone she met was sealed of her tribe. She thought it must be that P.E. Islanders were nicer, or at least more neighbourly than the Toronto people. She did not realise that the change was in herself. She was no longer rebuffed, frightened, awkward because she was frightened. Her foot was on her native heath, and her name was Jane. She felt friendly towards all the world, and all the world responded. She could love all she wanted to, everybody she wanted to, without being accused of low tastes. Probably grandmother would not have recognised Uncle Tombstone socially, but the standards of 60 Gay were not the standards of Lantern Hill. As for the Jimmy Johns, Jane felt she must have known them all her life. They were so called, she discovered, because Mr. James John Garland had a James Garland to the northeast of him and a John Garland to the southwest of him, and so had to be distinguished in some way. Her first forenoon at Lantern Hill, all the Jimmy Johns came galloping over in a body. At least, the young fry galloped with the 3 dogs, a brindled bull terrier, a golden collie, and a long brown dog, who was just a dog. Mrs. Jimmy John, who was as tall and thin as her Jimmy John was short and fat, with very wise, gentle grey eyes, walked briskly, carrying in her arms a baby as fat as a sausage. Miranda Jimmy John, who was 16, was as tall as her mother and as fat as her father. She had had a double chin at 10, and nobody would ever believe that she was secretly overflowing with romance. Polly Jimmy John was Jane's age, but looked younger because she was short and thin. Punch Jimmy John, who had brought the key, was 13. There were the 8-year-old twins, the George twin and the Ella twin, their bare chubby legs all spotted with mosquito bites, and every one of them had a pleasant smile. "Jane Victoria Stewart," said Mrs. Jimmy John with a questioning smile. "Jane," said Jane, with such an intonation of triumph that the Jimmy Johns all stared at her. "Jane, of course," smiled Mrs. Jimmy John. Jane knew that she was going to like Mrs. Jimmy John. Everybody except the baby had bought a present for Jane. Mrs. Jimmy John gave her a lambskin dyed red for a bedside rug. Miranda bought her a little fat white jug with pink roses on its sides. Punch brought her some early radishes. Polly brought her a rooted geranium slip, and the twins bought a toad apiece for her garden. "You have to have toads in your garden for luck," explained Punch. Jane felt that it would never do to let her first callers go home without something to eat, especially when they'd come bearing gifts. "Mrs. Mead's pie will go round if I don't take a piece," she thought. "The baby won't want any." The baby did want some, but Mrs. Jimmy John shared hers with him. They sat around in the kitchen on the chairs and on the sandstone doorstep and ate the pie while Jane radiated hospitality. "Come over whenever you can, dear," Mrs. Jimmy John told her. Mrs. Jimmy John thought Jane pretty young to be keeping house for anybody. "If there's any way we can help you, we'll be glad to." "Will you teach me how to make bread?" said Jane coolly. "We can get it at the corners, of course, but Dad likes homemade bread. And what kind of cake flour would you recommend?" Jane got acquainted with the Snowbeams also that week. The Solomon Snowbeams were a rather neglected rapscallion family who lived in a ramshackle house where the spruce barrens ran down to a curve of the harbour shore known as Hungry Cove. Nobody knew how Solomon Snowbeam contrived to feed his family. He fished a little, and worked out a little, and shot a little. Mrs. Snowbeam was a big, pink, overblown woman, and Caraway Snowbeam, Shingle Snowbeam, Penny Snowbeam, and young John Snowbeam were impudent, friendly little creatures who certainly did not look starved. Millicent Mary Snowbeam, aged 6, was neither impudent nor friendly. Millicent Mary was, so Polly Garland told Jane, not all there. She had blank, velvety nut-brown eyes. All the Snowbeams had beautiful eyes. Reddish-golden hair and a dazzling complexion. She could sit for hours without speaking. Perhaps that was why the chattering Jimmy Johns thought her not all there, with her fat arms clasped around her fat knees. She seemed to be possessed of a dumb admiration for Jane and haunted Lantern Hill all that summer, gazing at her. Jane did not mind her. If Millicent Mary did not talk, the rest of the Snowbeams made up for it. At first they were inclined to resent Jane a bit, thinking she must know everything because she came from Toronto and would be putting on airs about it. But when they discovered she hardly knew anything, except the little Uncle Tombstone had taught her about clams, they became very friendly. That is to say, they asked innumerable questions. There was no false delicacy about any of the Snowbeams. "Does your pa put live people in his stories?" said Penny. "No," said Jane. "Everyone round here says he does. Everybody's scared he'll put them in. He'd better not put us in if he doesn't want his snoot busted. I'm the toughest boy in Lantern Hill." "Do you think you're interesting enough to put in a story?" said Jane. Penny was a little scared of her after that. We've been wanting to see what you looked like, said Shingle, who wore overalls and looked like a boy, but wasn't. Because your pa and ma are divorced, aren't they? No, said Jane. Is your pa a widow then? Persisted Shingle. No. Does your ma live in Toronto? Yes. Why doesn't she live here with your pa? If you ask me any more questions about my parents, said Jane, I'll get my dad to put you into one of his stories, every one of you. Shingle was cowed, but Caraway took up the tale. Do you look like your mother? No, my mother is the most beautiful woman in Toronto, said Jane proudly. Do you live in a white marble house at home? No. Ding Dong Bell said you did, said Caraway in disgust. Ain't he the awful liar? I suppose you don't have satin bedspreads either. We have silk ones, said Jane. Ding Dong said you had satin. I see the butcher bringing your dinner up the lane, said young John. What are you having? Steak. My stars, we never have steak. Nothing but bread and molasses and fried salt pork. Dad says he can't look a pig in the face without grunting, and Mam says let him bring her home something else and she'll be mighty glad to cook it. Is that a cake you're making? Say, will you let me lick out the pan? Yes, but stand back from the table. Your shirt is all over chaff, ordered Jane. Ain't you the bossy snip, said young John. Foxy head, said Penny. They all went home mad because Jane Stewart had insulted young John. But they all came back the next day and forgivingly helped her weed and clean up her garden. It was hard work, and it was a hot day, so that their brows were wet with honest sweat long before they had done it to Jane's taste. If anybody had made them work as hard as that, they should have howled to high heaven. But when it was for fun, why, it was fun. Jane gave them the last of Mrs. Mead's cookies. She meant to try a batch of her own the next day anyhow. Jane had already decided that there was never a garden in the world like hers. She was crazy about it. An early, old-fashioned yellow rosebush was already in bloom. Shadows of poppies danced here and there. The stone dyke was smothered in wild rosebushes starred with crimson bud-sheaths. Pale lemon lilies and creamy June lilies grew in the corners. There were ribbon grass and mint, bleeding heart, prince's feather, southernwood, peonies, sweet balm, sweet May, sweet William, all with sated velvet bees humming over them. Aunt Matilda Jolly had been content with old-fashioned perennials, and Jane loved them too. But she made up her mind that by hook or crook she would have some annuals next summer. Jane, at the beginning of this summer, was already planning for next. In a very short time she was to be full of garden lore, and she was always trying to extract information about fertilizers from anybody who knew. Mr. Jimmy John gravely advised well-rotted cow manure, and Jane dragged basketfuls of it home from his barnyard. She loved to water the flowers, especially when the earth was a little dry and they drooped pleadingly. The garden rewarded her. She was one of those people at whose touch things grow. No weed was ever allowed to show its face. Jane got up early every morning to weed. It was wonderful to wake as the sun came over the sea. The mornings at Lantern Hill seemed different from mornings anywhere else, more morningish. Jane's heart sang as she weeded and raked and hoed and pruned and thinned out. "Who taught you these things, woman?" asked Dad. "I think I've always known them," said Jane dreamily. The Snowbeams told Jane that their cat had kittens and she could have one. Jane went down to choose. There were 4, and the poor, lean old mother cat was so proud and happy. Jane picked a black one with a pansy face, a really pansy face, so dark and velvety with round golden eyes. She named it Peter on the spot. Then the Jimmy Johns, not to be outdone, brought over a kitten also. But this kitten was already named Peter, and the Ella twin wept frantically over the idea of anybody changing it. So Dad suggested calling them First Peter and Second Peter, which Mrs. Snowbeam thought was sacrilegious. Second Peter was a dainty thing in black and silver with a soft white breast. Both Peters slept at the foot of Jane's bed and swarmed over Dad the minute he sat down. "What is a home without a dog?" said Dad, and got one from old Timothy Salt at the harbour mouth. They named him Happy. He was a slim white dog with a round brown spot at the root of his tail, a brown collar and brown ears. He kept the Peters in their place, and Jane loved him so much it hurt her. I like living things around me, Dad. Dad brought home the ship clock with the dog. Jane found it useful to set meal times by, but as far as anything else was concerned, there was really no such thing as time at Lantern Hill. By the end of a week, Jane knew the geography and people of Lantern Hill and Lantern Corners perfectly. Every hill seemed to belong to somebody. Big Donald's Hill, Little Donald's Hill, Old Man Cooper's Hill. She could pick out Big Donald Martin's farm and Little Donald Martin's farm. Every household light she could see from the hilltop had its own special significance. She knew just where to look to see Minmar's light sparkle out every night from the little white house in the misty fold of the hills. Min herself, an owl-eyed gypsy scrap full of ginger, was already a bosom friend of Jane's. Jane knew that Min's colourless ma was entirely unimportant, except as a background for Min. Min never would wear shoes or stockings in summer, and her bare feet twinkled over the red roads to Lantern Hill every day. Sometimes Elmer Bell, better known as Ding Dong, came with her. Ding Dong was freckled and his ears stuck out, but he was popular, though pursued through life by some scandalous tale of having sat in his porridge when he was an infant. When young John wanted to be especially annoying, he yelled at Ding Dong, "Sot in your porridge, you did, sot in your porridge." Elmer and Min and Polly Garland and Shingle and Jane were all children of the same year, and they all liked each other and snubbed each other and offended each other and stood up for each other against the older and younger fry. Jane gave up trying to believe she hadn't always been friends with them. She remembered the woman who had called Gay Street dead. Well, Aunt Matilda Jolly's house wasn't dead. It was alive, every inch of it. Jane's friends swarmed all over it. "You're so nice, you ought to have been born in P.E. Island," Ding Dong told her. "I was," said Jane triumphantly.